March 15, 1973. Marcus Williams had 3 days before the shelter would kick him out. At 12 years old, he'd been surviving on Detroit streets for 6 months, singing Marvin Gaye songs for loose change. That afternoon, as he performed What's Going On one more time, a black Cadillac pulled up. The driver stepped out, and Marcus's world shifted forever. Sometimes salvation arrives exactly when hope runs out. If you want to understand how one moment can change 2 lives forever, make sure to subscribe to our channel because Marcus Williams' story reveals not just a chance encounter but the hidden struggles that shaped one of soul music's greatest legends during his most turbulent period. Detroit in the early 70s was a city caught between hope and despair. The Motown sound had put the city on the musical map, but urban decay was spreading like wildfire through neighborhoods that had once thrived. On the east side, where the old automotive plants stood silent, children learned survival before they learned algebra. Marcus Williams was one of these children, though his story began not in Detroit's gritty streets but in the rural outskirts of Mississippi. Marcus had arrived in Detroit 6 months earlier, traveling north in the back of his uncle's pickup truck after his grandmother's death. His mother had disappeared when he was 8, leaving him in the care of an elderly woman who could barely afford to feed herself. When she passed away in September of 1972, Marcus found himself with nowhere to go and no family willing to take him in. His uncle Jerome, a factory worker in Detroit, had promised Marcus a place to stay, but that promise lasted exactly 2 weeks before Jerome's drinking problem and violent temper made it clear that the streets were safer than the cramped apartment on 8 Mile Road. The boy quickly learned that Detroit's streets had their own economy, their own rules, and their own kind of education. Corner stores would sometimes give him day-old bread in exchange for sweeping their steps. Churches offered occasional meals, but they came with sermons that reminded Marcus of promises that seemed to break as easily as they were made. The one thing that kept him going, the one thing that made him feel connected to something larger than his daily struggle for survival, was music. Marcus had inherited his voice from his mother, along with her battered acoustic guitar. The instrument had 6 strings when he started, but now only 4 remained functional. Even so, he could coax melodies from it that stopped pedestrians in their tracks. He discovered early on that certain songs drew more coins than others. Gospel brought sympathy but little money. Rock and roll brought attention but often the wrong kind. But soul music, especially the songs of Marvin Gaye, seemed to touch something deep in the hearts of Detroit's residents. What's Going On had become Marcus's signature song, though he understood its lyrics in ways that most 12-year-olds never should. When Marvin Gaye had released the song 2 years earlier, it spoke to a nation grappling with war, social unrest, and generational conflict. For Marcus, singing those words on street corners, the song became something more personal. It was his daily prayer, his cry for help, and his connection to a world that seemed determined to forget he existed. The corner of Cass Avenue and Willis Street had become Marcus's regular spot. It was positioned perfectly between the bus stop and a small grocery store, ensuring a steady stream of foot traffic throughout the day. The owner of the grocery store, Mrs. Henderson, had grown accustomed to the boy's presence and occasionally brought him a sandwich or a cup of hot coffee on particularly cold days. She never asked too many questions, understanding instinctively that some stories were too heavy for casual conversation. On that particular March afternoon, Marcus had been singing for nearly 3 hours. His guitar case, lined with an old towel his grandmother had given him, contained exactly $1.37. It wasn't enough for a proper meal, but it might buy him some crackers and maybe a small carton of milk. The spring air still carried winter's bite, and Marcus's thin jacket offered little protection against the wind that whipped between the tall buildings of downtown Detroit. As he began another rendition of What's Going On, Marcus noticed the black Cadillac slowing down. This wasn't unusual in itself. Sometimes people would slow down to listen, occasionally rolling down their windows to toss a quarter or two into his case. But this car actually pulled over to the curb, its engine idling as the driver sat inside, apparently listening. Marcus continued singing, though he felt a strange nervousness building in his chest. Something about this moment felt different. Marvin Gaye had been driving aimlessly through Detroit's east side, a habit he'd developed when the pressures of fame and the music industry became overwhelming. The previous year had been particularly challenging for him. His marriage to Anna Gordy was falling apart. His relationship with Motown was strained, and he was struggling with depression that sometimes made it difficult to get out of bed, let alone create music. These drives through the neighborhoods where he'd grown up served as a form of therapy, reminding him of who he was before the world knew his name. The voice that stopped him wasn't particularly powerful or technically perfect. It was something else entirely. It was authentic in a way that the polished voices he heard in recording studios rarely were. This child was singing Marvin's own words back to him, but with an understanding that seemed impossible for someone so young. Every note carried weight. Every pause held meaning. It was as if the boy had lived through the experiences that had inspired the song, rather than simply learning the melody. Marvin sat in his car for several minutes, watching the thin boy with the broken guitar. The child's clothes were clean but worn, and there was something in his posture that spoke of resilience born from necessity. When Marcus finished the song and immediately began it again, Marvin realized that this wasn't a performance for the sake of performance. This was survival. The decision to get out of the car wasn't calculated or planned. It was instinctive, driven by something deeper than curiosity. As Marvin approached the boy, he noticed how Marcus's eyes widened with recognition, though the singing never stopped. The child's voice actually grew stronger, as if he understood that this moment was somehow significant, even if he couldn't yet comprehend how significant it would prove to be. When Marcus saw Marvin Gaye walking toward him, his first thought was that he must be hallucinating from hunger. He'd been eating irregularly for weeks, and sometimes his mind played tricks on him. But as the man drew closer, Marcus could see the distinctive features that had graced album covers and television screens. This was really happening. Marvin Gaye, the voice behind the songs that had kept Marcus company through countless lonely nights, was standing right in front of him. Marvin waited until Marcus finished the verse before speaking. "That's a beautiful version of my song," he said quietly, his voice carrying the same smooth tone that had made him famous. Marcus stopped playing entirely, his hands frozen on the guitar strings. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The sounds of the city continued around them, traffic, distant conversations, the hum of urban life, but in that small space between them, everything felt suspended. "You wrote it?" Marcus asked, though he already knew the answer. His voice was barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might break whatever spell had brought this moment into existence. Marvin nodded, studying the boy's face with an intensity that Marcus found both comforting and overwhelming. There was kindness in the man's eyes, but also a sadness that Marcus recognized from his own reflection in store windows. "I did," Marvin replied, "but I think you understand it better than I do." This wasn't flattery or condescension. Marvin could hear in Marcus's interpretation something that his own performances sometimes lacked, a raw honesty that came from living the questions the song asked rather than simply asking them. "What's your name, son?" "Marcus Williams," the boy replied, finally setting his guitar aside. "I know all your songs, Mr. Gaye. They're Marcus War, they help me, you know." It was the most personal thing Marcus had shared with another human being in months, and saying it out loud made him feel both vulnerable and relieved. What happened next surprised both of them. Instead of offering a few dollars and moving on, Marvin sat down on the concrete steps next to Marcus's makeshift performance space. For anyone watching from a distance, it might have looked like an older brother or uncle checking in with a young relative. The reality was far more complex and meaningful. Marvin began asking questions, not the intrusive kind that social workers or police officers asked, but genuine inquiries about Marcus's life, his music, and his dreams. Marcus found himself talking more openly than he had in months, sharing stories about his grandmother in Mississippi, his brief time with his uncle, and the strange freedom he'd found in living on Detroit's streets. He told Marvin about the songs that earned the most money, the corners that were safest for performing, and the people who had shown him kindness when he needed it most. In return, Marvin shared something that few people in his life ever heard, the truth about his own struggles. He talked about the pressure of living up to expectations, the isolation that came with fame, and the way success could sometimes feel like a prison. He mentioned his own difficult childhood, growing up with a father whose strictness had sometimes crossed into cruelty, and how music had become his escape from a world that often felt hostile and unforgiving. As they talked, Marcus began to understand that this famous man sitting next to him carried burdens that weren't so different from his own. They were both seeking something: connection, understanding, a sense of purpose that went beyond mere survival. The difference was that Marvin had found success but was struggling with meaning, while Marcus was struggling with survival but had somehow maintained a clarity of purpose that impressed the older man. The conversation lasted nearly an hour, during which several people recognized Marvin and approached for autographs. Each time, Marvin politely but firmly redirected their attention away from Marcus, protecting the boy's privacy while making it clear that this was not a publicity stunt or casual encounter. He treated Marcus with the same respect he would show any adult, listening to his opinions about music and life with genuine interest. As the afternoon sun began to cast longer shadows across Cass Avenue, Marvin faced a decision that would alter both their lives. He could give Marcus some money, wish him well, and drive away feeling good about a charitable gesture. Or he could do something more substantial, something that addressed not just the boy's immediate needs but his long-term potential. The choice seemed obvious, but the implications were enormous. Marvin had never considered himself particularly paternal. His own relationship with his father was complicated and often painful, leaving him uncertain about his ability to guide or mentor anyone, especially a child. But something about Marcus's combination of talent, resilience, and vulnerability awakened a protective instinct that Marvin hadn't known he possessed. This wasn't just about helping a homeless child. It was about recognizing and nurturing a genuine gift that might otherwise be lost to the harsh realities of street life. The practical challenges were significant. Marvin's lifestyle, with its irregular hours, travel demands, and personal struggles, wasn't exactly conducive to caring for a 12-year-old. His relationship with Anna was deteriorating. His finances were more complicated than the public realized, and he was dealing with his own emotional issues that sometimes made it difficult to take care of himself, let alone someone else. But looking at Marcus, hearing the boy's voice carry his own lyrics with such authentic emotion, Marvin knew that walking away wasn't an option. "Marcus," Marvin said finally, his voice carrying a weight that made the boy look up from his guitar. "How would you feel about coming with me for a while? I've got space where you could stay, and maybe we could work on your music together." It was a question that carried enormous implications, and Marvin found himself holding his breath as he waited for the answer. Marcus stared at him for a long moment, his mind racing through possibilities he'd hardly dared to imagine. The streets had taught him to be suspicious of offers that seemed too good to be true. But there was something in Marvin's manner that felt genuine. This wasn't pity or charity. It was recognition of something valuable that might be lost if not carefully tended. What Marcus couldn't know at that moment was that his acceptance of Marvin's offer would set in motion a chain of events that would influence not just his own future but Marvin's creative development as well. The experience of mentoring Marcus would inspire some of Marvin's most heartfelt compositions in the years that followed. Songs that dealt with themes of fatherhood, responsibility, and the passing of wisdom from one generation to the next. The immediate practical arrangements were handled with surprising efficiency. Marvin made a few phone calls from a nearby payphone, speaking to his assistant about preparing a room in his Detroit home and contacting a lawyer about the legal requirements for providing care to a minor. Marcus packed his few possessions, the guitar, a change of clothes, a worn photograph of his grandmother, and a small notebook where he'd been writing his own song lyrics, into a paper bag that served as his only luggage. The drive to Marvin's house was surreal for Marcus. Just hours earlier, he'd been wondering where he would sleep that night and whether he'd have enough money for food. Now he was riding in a luxury car with one of the most famous musicians in the world, heading toward a future that seemed almost impossible to comprehend. The city looked different from inside the Cadillac. Cleaner, more hopeful, full of possibilities that hadn't existed in the morning. Marvin's home was unlike anything Marcus had ever seen. The rooms were spacious and filled with musical instruments, recording equipment, and gold records that reflected the afternoon light streaming through large windows. But what impressed Marcus most wasn't the luxury. It was the feeling of safety that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. For the first time in months, he allowed himself to relax completely, to stop scanning for threats or calculating escape routes. That first evening, Marvin and Marcus sat at the piano in Marvin's home studio, working through some of the songs that Marcus had learned during his time on the streets. Marvin was struck by how naturally the boy approached music, how he seemed to understand instinctively the emotional core of each song rather than just its technical requirements. Marcus had never had formal training, but he possessed something that couldn't be taught, an ability to find the heart of a melody and express it with complete honesty. As they played together, Marvin began to see possibilities for Marcus that extended far beyond basic survival. The boy had the potential to become a serious musician, not just someone who could carry a tune, but an artist who could create something meaningful and lasting. But Marvin also understood that this potential would require careful nurturing, proper education, and most importantly, the kind of stable environment that would allow Marcus to develop as both a musician and a young man. The legal arrangements took several weeks to complete, involving social workers, court hearings, and extensive background checks. During this time, Marcus lived in Marvin's guest room, attending a nearby school during the day and spending evenings in the studio, learning not just how to play music, but how to understand it on a deeper level. Marvin introduced him to jazz, classical music, and blues recordings that expanded Marcus's musical vocabulary beyond what he'd picked up on the streets. The transformation in both of them was remarkable. Marcus began to put on weight as regular meals replaced his previous hand-to-mouth existence. His confidence grew as he realized that his musical instincts were not only valid but valuable. For Marvin, having Marcus in his life provided a sense of purpose that had been missing from his recent work. The act of teaching and mentoring forced him to articulate his own musical philosophy in ways he'd never had to before, leading to insights that would influence his future compositions. The arrangement wasn't without its difficulties. Marcus had developed survival instincts that didn't disappear overnight. He hoarded food in his room, sometimes slept on the floor instead of the bed, and had difficulty trusting that this new situation would last. There were moments when the cultural and economic differences between his background and Marvin's lifestyle created tension and misunderstanding. Marvin, for his part, struggled with the day-to-day responsibilities of caring for a child. His own upbringing had been marked by his father's harsh discipline and emotional distance, leaving him uncertain about how to provide guidance without being authoritarian. There were times when his own depression made it difficult to be the steady presence that Marcus needed, and he worried constantly about whether he was qualified to shape another person's life. But these challenges were outweighed by the genuine affection and respect that developed between them. Marcus proved to be remarkably resilient and adaptable, eager to learn and quick to forgive the inevitable mistakes that came with their unconventional relationship. Marvin discovered that teaching Marcus helped him rediscover his own passion for music, reminding him of why he'd started making music in the first place. The musical collaboration that emerged from their relationship was extraordinary. Marcus's raw emotional honesty influenced Marvin's writing, encouraging him to explore themes of family, responsibility, and hope that hadn't been prominent in his earlier work. In return, Marvin's technical expertise and industry knowledge gave Marcus the tools to transform his natural talent into genuine artistry. News of Marvin's mentorship of Marcus spread slowly through the music industry, creating a mixture of admiration and curiosity. Some saw it as a publicity stunt, others as evidence of Marvin's growing instability. But those who spent time with both of them could see that the relationship was genuine and mutually beneficial. Marcus wasn't being exploited or used. He was being nurtured and developed by someone who understood both his potential and his needs. The experience also had a profound impact on Marvin's relationship with his own family. Caring for Marcus helped him understand some of the challenges his father had faced, though it also reinforced his determination to break the cycle of emotional distance and harsh discipline that had marked his own childhood. When Marvin's son, Marvin III, was born several years later, the lessons he'd learned from raising Marcus proved invaluable. Marcus, meanwhile, flourished in ways that went far beyond music. With stable housing, regular meals, and access to education, he began to develop interests in science, literature, and history that complemented his musical abilities. Marvin encouraged this intellectual curiosity, understanding that true artistry required a broad understanding of the world and human experience. The boy who had once sung for survival on Detroit street corners was becoming a well-rounded young man with unlimited potential. But perhaps most importantly, he was learning that kindness and generosity weren't weaknesses but strengths, lessons that would shape how he treated others throughout his life. The story of Marvin Gaye and Marcus Williams became something of a legend in Detroit's music community, a reminder that art had the power not just to entertain but to transform lives. For Marcus, that chance encounter on Cass Avenue represented not just rescue from immediate hardship, but the beginning of a life filled with possibilities he'd never dared to imagine. Years later, as Marcus pursued his own musical career, he would often tell interviewers that the most important lesson Marvin taught him wasn't about music theory or performance technique. It was about the responsibility that came with talent, the obligation to use whatever gifts you possessed in service of something larger than yourself. Marvin had seen potential in a homeless boy singing on a street corner, and had been willing to invest his time, resources, and emotional energy in nurturing that potential. The relationship between Marvin and Marcus also demonstrated something important about the nature of helping others. This wasn't charity in the traditional sense, with a clear distinction between giver and receiver. Instead, it was a mutual exchange that benefited both parties, with Marcus's authenticity and resilience helping Marvin rediscover his own artistic purpose just as much as Marvin's guidance helped Marcus develop his talents. For Marvin, the experience of mentoring Marcus provided a sense of meaning that had been missing from his life during one of his most difficult periods. The knowledge that he had played a role in saving and developing a young life gave weight to his own existence that commercial success alone had never provided. In helping Marcus, Marvin had also helped himself, discovering reserves of patience, generosity, and wisdom that he hadn't known he possessed. Marcus Williams never forgot the lesson of that March afternoon in 1973. Even as he achieved success in his own right, he remained connected to the streets that had shaped him, often returning to perform benefit concerts for homeless shelters and youth programs, He established a foundation that provided musical instruments and lessons to disadvantaged children, understanding that talent could emerge from the most unlikely circumstances if given proper support and encouragement. The guitar that Marcus had been playing on that fateful day, the battered acoustic with only 4 working strings, became one of his most treasured possessions. He had it professionally restored but kept it exactly as it was during his street performing days, using it in recording sessions when he wanted to capture a particular kind of raw authenticity. The instrument served as a reminder of how far he'd come, and the generosity that had made his transformation possible. Marvin continued to be a presence in Marcus's life long after the formal guardianship arrangements ended. Their relationship evolved from mentor and student to something more like father and son, and eventually to the mutual respect of 2 professional musicians who shared a deep appreciation for each other's artistry. When Marvin died in 1984, Marcus was one of the pallbearers at his funeral, a testament to the bond that had formed between them. The story of their meeting became part of Detroit's musical folklore, told and retold in slightly different versions, but always maintaining its essential message that a single moment of compassion could change the trajectory of a life. For visitors to Detroit who knew the story, the corner of Cass Avenue and Willis Street became an unofficial landmark, a place where the power of human connection had triumphed over the harsh realities of urban survival. Today, more than 50 years after that chance encounter, the story of Marvin Gaye and Marcus Williams continues to resonate because it speaks to universal truths about potential, opportunity, and the responsibility we have to help one another. Marcus's voice, carrying Marvin's words across a Detroit street corner, had created a moment of recognition that transcended the usual boundaries of race, class, and circumstance. The story reminds us that talent can emerge from anywhere, often in forms we don't expect or in circumstances that seem unpromising. Marcus's ability to interpret what's going on with such emotional depth despite his youth and difficult circumstances demonstrated that artistic understanding isn't dependent on formal training or privileged background. Sometimes the most authentic expressions come from those who have lived the experiences that inspire great art. It also illustrates the transformative power of seeing potential in others and being willing to invest in that potential without guarantee of return. Marvin's decision to help Marcus wasn't based on a careful calculation of likely outcomes. It was an instinctive response to recognizing something valuable that might be lost if not protected and nurtured. That willingness to take a chance on another person, to see possibilities where others might see only problems, represents the kind of faith in human potential that makes extraordinary outcomes possible. Perhaps most importantly, the story demonstrates that help and healing can be mutual, that the act of giving can be as transformative for the giver as for the receiver. Marvin found in Marcus not just an opportunity to do good, but a chance to rediscover his own sense of purpose and connection to the music that had made him famous. In teaching Marcus about music and life, Marvin learned important lessons about patience, responsibility, and the satisfaction that comes from using one's talents in service of others. The corner where it all began still exists, though the neighborhood around it has changed dramatically over the decades. Sometimes, on quiet afternoons, if you listen carefully, you might still hear the echo of a young voice singing about what's going on, asking the eternal questions that connect us all to our shared humanity. And in that echo, you might hear the reminder that salvation can arrive in the most unexpected forms, at the moments when hope seems furthest away. The black Cadillac is long gone, and the voices that created that magical moment have been stilled by time. But the story lives on, a testament to the power of music to create connections that transcend circumstance, and to the human capacity for compassion that can transform lives with a single decision to stop, listen, and care.